You are standing in the marble corridors of the Palatine Hill in Rome. Year 37 AD, the morning sun filters through the columns as you hear something that makes your blood run cold, the sound of horseshoes on marble floors, but not just any horse. This is Incitatus, and he's being led to what should be a meeting of the Roman Senate. But here's what will shock you. This horse isn't just attending the meeting. According to the mad Emperor Caligula, this horse is about to become a Roman consul, one of the highest positions in the empire. What you're about to witness isn't just the story of a crazy emperor and his pet horse. It's the story of how absolute power can transform love into obsession, grief into madness, and turn the greatest empire on earth into a theater of the absurd. Before we dive into this incredible tale of imperial madness, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand how a horse almost became a Roman consul, we need to go back to the beginning. To a little boy who would grow up to become one of history's most notorious rulers. His real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but history knows him by his nickname, Caligula, which means little boot. He got this name as a child when he accompanied his father Germanicus on military campaigns, dressed in a miniature soldier's uniform complete with tiny military boots. The Roman legions adored this little boy who marched among them, and they called him their mascot, their little boot. But Caligula's childhood was far from the innocent military adventure it appeared to be. He was born into the most dangerous family in Rome, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, where relatives murdered each other for power as casually as others might change clothes. His great-uncle was the Emperor Tiberius, a man so paranoid and cruel that he eventually retreated to the island of Capri, ruling Rome from a distance while indulging in unspeakable cruelties. His grandfather was the beloved general Germanicus, whose suspicious death had convinced many Romans that Tiberius had him poisoned to eliminate a potential rival. Young Caligula learned early that in his family, love and murder were often indistinguishable. He watched as Tiberius systematically destroyed his mother Agrippina, the elder, and his brothers, either through execution, exile, or driving them to suicide. By the time Caligula was summoned to live with Tiberius on Capri at age 19, he was the last surviving male heir of his generation. But survival in Tiberius's court required more than just luck. It required the ability to become someone else entirely. The island of Capri was a paradise turned into hell. Tiberius had transformed this beautiful retreat into a laboratory for his darkest impulses, surrounding himself with philosophers who justified his cruelties and architects who built elaborate stages for his perversions. Here, young Caligula learned to wear masks. He became whatever Tiberius wanted him to be, a devoted great-nephew, a willing student, an enthusiastic participant in activities that would have horrified the Roman people. But behind his compliance, something twisted was growing. Historians would later wonder whether Caligula's madness was born on Capri, or whether it was always there waiting for the right conditions to flourish. When Tiberius died in 37 AD, some say with Caligula's help. Though this was never proven, the 24-year-old prince returned to Rome as emperor. The welcome he received was unprecedented in Roman history. Citizens lined the streets weeping with joy, throwing flowers and calling out blessings. After years of Tiberius's harsh rule, Caligula represented hope, youth, and a return to the golden age of his great-great-grandfather Augustus. The Senate unanimously confirmed his position, and even the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite military force, swore their loyalty with genuine enthusiasm. For the first few months of his reign, Caligula seemed to justify this faith. He released political prisoners, recalled exiles, held magnificent games for the people, and gave generous bonuses to the military. He honored his family's memory, bringing back the remains of his mother and brothers for proper burial with elaborate funeral ceremonies that moved the entire city to tears. Rome had not seen such displays of filial devotion and public generosity for decades. Citizens began to speak of a new golden age, comparing their young emperor to the greatest rulers of legend. But power, they say, reveals character, and what power revealed about Caligula was terrifying. The change began gradually. small signs that those closest to him began to notice with growing alarm. He started spending enormous sums on increasingly elaborate spectacles, not just for public entertainment, but seemingly for his own private amusement. He commissioned the construction of temporary bridges across the Bay of Naples, so he could ride his horse across the water. Fulfilling a prophecy while bankrupting the treasury, he ordered the construction of new palaces that defied both engineering and economic logic. More disturbing were his private behaviors. Palace servants whispered about his conversations with statues of the gods, speaking to them as equals and claiming they spoke back. He began appearing in public, dressed as various deities: Venus, Diana, even Jupiter himself, demanding that citizens worship him not just as emperor, but as a living god. When foreign delegations came to pay their respects, he required them to prostrate themselves completely, a practice that horrified Roman senators who prided themselves on their dignity. It was during this period of escalating grandiosity that Incitatus entered the story. The horse was magnificent, a cream-colored stallion with exceptional bloodlines and the kind of graceful bearing that made him stand out, even among the emperor's extensive stable. But Caligula's relationship with Incitatus went far beyond the normal affection between a man and his favorite horse. Ancient historians describe a level of devotion that shocked even Romans accustomed to their ruler's eccentricities. Incitatus lived in a stable that was more luxurious than most Roman homes. The walls were made of marble, the manger was carved from ivory, and the blankets were purple silk, a color officially reserved for royalty. The horse wore a jeweled collar worth more than most Roman citizens would earn in a lifetime, and his daily care required a staff of servants who tended to his every need with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. But this was only the beginning of Caligula's obsession. The emperor began treating Incitatus as if he were human. He would invite the horse to dinner parties, having slaves bring him golden buckets of oats, while human guests were served on silver platters. During these bizarre gatherings, Caligula would carry on conversations with Incitatus as if the horse were responding, nodding sagely at imaginary equine wisdom and laughing at jokes that only he could hear. Guests at these dinners faced an impossible choice: participate in the emperor's delusion and risk their own sanity, or maintain their dignity and risk their lives. But Caligula's treatment of Incitatus revealed something darker than mere eccentricity. It was a calculated insult to the Roman establishment, a way of demonstrating that their emperor considered his horse more worthy of respect than Rome's most distinguished citizens. When senators came to pay their respects, Caligula would sometimes keep them waiting while he personally groomed Incitatus, making it clear where his priorities lay. The horse became a living symbol of the emperor's contempt for traditional Roman values and institutions. The situation reached its peak when Caligula announced his intention to make Incitatus a consul, one of the two highest elected offices in the Roman Republic. This wasn't just a mad whim. It was a declaration of war against the entire Roman political system. The consulship was the pinnacle of Roman political achievement, a position that had been held by legends like Cicero, Caesar, and Augustus himself. To give this honor to a horse was to declare that Roman tradition, Roman dignity, and Roman government itself meant nothing to the emperor. The announcement sent shockwaves through the capital. Senators who had spent their entire lives climbing the political ladder, serving in lesser offices and building alliances in hopes of someday achieving the consulship, now faced the prospect of sharing their most cherished honor with an animal. Some laughed, thinking it must be an elaborate joke. Others wept, understanding that their emperor had moved beyond eccentricity into genuine madness. But none dared to object openly, knowing that Caligula's sense of humor was matched only by his capacity for cruelty. Preparations for Incitatus's consulship began immediately. Craftsmen were commissioned to create a special toga for the horse, scaled to fit his equine proportions, but maintaining all the traditional dignity of the office. A ceremonial chair was designed that could accommodate his unique anatomy, while allowing him to participate in Senate meetings. Most surreally, speechwriters were assigned to compose the horse's inaugural address, though how this was to be delivered remained an open question. The Roman people's reaction to these developments revealed the complex relationship between ruler and ruled in the imperial system. In public, citizens maintained careful neutrality, understanding that open criticism of the emperor's decisions could be interpreted as treason. But in private, the city buzzed with gallows humor and barely suppressed hysteria. Street vendors sold miniature horse figurines dressed as consuls, while graffiti artists drew equine caricatures on walls throughout the city. Rome was learning to cope with madness through satire, though always at the risk of their lives. Meanwhile, Caligula's obsession with his horse continued to escalate in ways that defied rational explanation. He began consulting Incitatus on matters of state, claiming that the horse's wisdom surpassed that of his human advisors. Military decisions were allegedly influenced by the horse's behavior. If Incitatus seemed energetic, it was a good day for aggressive action. If he appeared tired, perhaps diplomacy was called for. Foreign ambassadors found themselves in the surreal position of having to acknowledge a horse's political opinions as if they carried the weight of imperial policy. The emperor's relationship with Incitatus also took on religious dimensions that horrified traditional Romans. Caligula began claiming that the horse was a reincarnation of Alexander the Great's famous steed Bucephalus, by extension, a divine being worthy of worship. Temples were constructed in Incitatus's honor, complete with priests who performed daily rituals and citizens who were encouraged to make offerings. The horse had become not just a political figure but a religious icon in Caligula's increasingly bizarre personal mythology. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Incitatus affair was what it revealed about the emperor's psychological state. Ancient historians who witnessed these events suggested that Caligula's devotion to his horse was a manifestation of his complete inability to form normal human relationships. Having grown up in an environment where human contact meant betrayal and death, perhaps he found in Incitatus the only being he could trust completely. The horse couldn't plot against him, couldn't lie to him, couldn't manipulate him for personal gain. In a world where everyone wanted something from the emperor, Incitatus wanted only oats and grooming. This interpretation becomes even more chilling when we consider what happened to humans who tried to get close to Caligula during this period. Friends, advisors, and even family members found themselves subjected to increasingly paranoid scrutiny. The emperor would test their loyalty through elaborate schemes, demanding they participate in humiliating rituals or make impossible choices between their dignity and their lives. Those who passed these tests might find themselves promoted to positions of great responsibility. Those who failed simply disappeared. The economic impact of Caligula's obsessions, including his lavish spending on Incitatus, was devastating to the Roman treasury. The emperor had inherited a substantial surplus from the frugal Tiberius, but within months he had spent it all on games, buildings, and luxuries for his favorite horse. New taxes were imposed on the most creative pretexts. Citizens could be charged for walking on certain streets, for getting married, for getting divorced, even for appearing in the emperor's dreams. The horse's expensive lifestyle was literally being funded by the suffering of ordinary Romans. As word of Incitatus's impending consulship spread throughout the empire, reactions varied dramatically by region and social class. In the eastern provinces, where ruler worship was more common, some citizens seemed willing to accept even this bizarre development as simply another expression of their god-temperor's divine will. But in the more traditionally Roman areas, particularly among the military, murmurs of discontent began to grow louder. Soldiers who had sworn oaths to serve Rome found themselves questioning whether they were actually serving a madman's fantasies. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite military unit responsible for protecting the emperor, found themselves in a particularly impossible position. Their duty was to defend Caligula's life, but their oath was ultimately to Rome itself. As they watched their emperor prepare to install a horse in one of the Republic's most sacred offices, some began to wonder whether protecting Caligula was actually betraying Rome. These dangerous thoughts would eventually coalesce into action. But not before the horse had his moment in the sun. The formal ceremony for Incitatus's consulship was scheduled for the Ides of January, a date chosen by Caligula for its historical significance. As the day approached, the city filled with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Citizens genuinely didn't know what to expect. Would the emperor actually go through with it, or would he reveal it as an elaborate joke at the last moment? Foreign diplomats prepared carefully worded dispatches to their home governments, trying to explain developments that defied rational description. But the ceremony never took place. On January 24th, 41 AD, just days before Incitatus was to assume his consulship, Caligula was assassinated by members of his own Praetorian Guard. The plot was led by Cassius Chaerea, a veteran officer who had endured years of humiliation at the emperor's hands. The assassination took place in an underground corridor of the palace, where Caligula was stabbed repeatedly by conspirators who had decided that Rome's honor was more important than their own lives. The immediate aftermath of Caligula's death revealed just how isolated the emperor had become. There was no mass outpouring of grief, no calls for vengeance against his killers. Instead, the Senate initially declared the restoration of the Republic, as if the last century of imperial rule had been a bad dream from which Rome was finally awakening. But this fantasy lasted only hours before the Praetorian Guard found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding behind a curtain in the palace and declared him emperor instead. What happened to Incitatus after his master's death remains one of history's minor mysteries. Some sources suggest he was quietly retired to a normal stable, living out his days as an ordinary horse. Others claim he was sacrificed as part of the ritual purification that followed Caligula's assassination, his death symbolically ending the madness that had gripped Rome. But perhaps the most fitting end would have been for Incitatus to simply fade into obscurity, returning to the anonymity from which Caligula's obsession had briefly elevated him. The story of Caligula and Incitatus became a cautionary tale that echoed through Roman history and beyond. It demonstrated the dangers of absolute power unchecked by institutions or tradition, showing how quickly a promising young ruler could degenerate into a tyrant whose whims threatened the very foundations of civilization. But it also revealed something deeper about human nature, the way that isolation, paranoia, and unlimited authority can transform love into madness and turn the pursuit of power into a form of insanity. Modern historians continue to debate whether Caligula was genuinely mad or simply a cruel manipulator who used the appearance of insanity to terrorize his subjects into submission. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Caligula was almost certainly mentally ill, but his illness manifested in ways that were shaped by his unique position and circumstances. In a different time and place, his problems might have remained private eccentricities. But as emperor of Rome, his personal demons became the empire's nightmare. The horse that almost became a consul serves as a perfect symbol for the absurdity that can result when human institutions lose their connection to human values. Incitatus didn't ask to be elevated to political office. He was simply an animal caught up in his master's delusions. But his story reminds us that even the most established traditions and powerful institutions can be corrupted, when those who lead them lose sight of their fundamental purpose. As we reflect on this strange chapter in Roman history, we might ask ourselves what lessons it holds for our own time. The specific circumstances that allowed Caligula to elevate his horse to high office are unique to ancient Rome. But the underlying dynamics, the concentration of power, the corruption of institutions, the substitution of personal whim for rational governance, are depressingly familiar across different eras and cultures. The story of Incitatus reminds us that democracy and republican institutions exist not just as abstract ideals, but as practical safeguards against the human tendency toward tyranny and madness. When those safeguards fail, the results can be tragic, absurd, or both. A horse may never again be appointed to high political office. But the forces that made such an appointment possible remain as dangerous today as they were in ancient Rome. In the end, Caligula's obsession with his horse was both symptom and symbol of a deeper corruption that threatened to destroy one of history's greatest civilizations. The fact that Rome survived this crisis and went on to achieve even greater heights under subsequent emperors, like Marcus Aurelius and Trajan, suggests that institutions, however damaged, can recover from even the most severe abuse. But recovery requires recognizing madness for what it is and finding the courage to oppose it, even when that opposition comes at great personal cost. The marble corridors of the Palatine Hill still echo with the ghost of horse hooves, reminding us that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and that even the mightiest empires are only as strong as the wisdom and courage of those who serve them.